Why you wouldn't last a day as King Baldwin IV. You would not last a day. Not one sunrise to sunset. You would break before the first leper's bell stopped tolling. And I am not saying this to insult you. I am saying it because you have never tasted the air of Jerusalem in the 12th century with a body that is already dying while still alive. You have never worn a crown that hides a rotting face. You have never given an order while your own fingers refuse to grip the reins of a horse. You think you know suffering? You think you know duty? You know nothing. Sit down. Listen. I will tell you exactly why you would not last a day as Baldwin IV, the Leper King, and by the time I am done, you will be grateful for your ordinary, painless, anonymous life. First, let us talk about waking up. You imagine a king waking to servants, to sunlight through silk curtains, to the smell of fresh bread. Baldwin woke to the smell of himself. The sweet, cloying odor of decaying flesh that no amount of frankincense could mask. Every morning he had to open eyes that might not fully close anymore because the lids had thickened and lost their function. He had to check, with what remained of the sensation in his extremities, whether he had accidentally knocked a foot against the bedpost in the night and not felt it, leaving a wound that would fester for weeks because leprosy had stolen the pain signals. You would already be weeping by that moment. You, who wince at a paper cut, who complain about a bad mattress, you would be face down in a pillow soaked with the leakage from your own lesions before you even sat up. And that would be minute one of your day. Not an hour. A minute. Baldwin then had to be dressed. Not by servants delicately handling a royal physique, but by men who had to steel themselves to touch a body that was visibly, actively unmaking itself. The royal tunic, the white mantle with the cross of Jerusalem, all of it placed over bandages that were already seeping. You have never felt the exquisite torture of linen sticking to open sores, only to have it pulled away gently by someone trying very hard not to gag. Baldwin endured this without screaming. He had learned to turn his vocal cords into instruments of command rather than cries of agony. You would have begged for death by the third button. Then there was the mask. The famous silver mask. Do you think that was for vanity? For mystery? It was necessity. By the time he was crowned at 13, his face was already showing the nodules, the thickening, the leonine distortion that made hardened Crusader knights flinch. That mask was not just metal, it was a statement. It said, I am still a man, I am still your king, and I will not let you see what this disease is doing to me because your faith in me depends on forgetting my flesh. The mask chafed against skin that had almost no protective barrier left. Imagine wearing a cheese grater on your face, but it's polished silver, and you must never take it off in public, not even to scratch, not even to breathe freely, because the air itself is an enemy. Dust, insects, the glances of courtiers. You would rip it off in a tantrum within 5 minutes. You would scream, I cannot breathe. And then you would reveal the truth. Not a king, but a wreck. Baldwin wore it for hours while negotiating treaties, while hearing reports of Saladin's movements, while staring down barons who wanted him dead. Your discomfort threshold would be breached before breakfast. Ah, breakfast. Let us talk about eating. With leprosy, the throat can become involved. Swallowing becomes a calculated act. The soft palate might be compromised, so food can go up into the nasal cavity. The hands might not hold utensils properly. Baldwin had to consume enough to keep what was left of his strength, knowing that every meal was a potential choking hazard, and also knowing that his body was absorbing nutrients poorly because the disease interfered with everything. You, who grumble about cold coffee, would be facing lukewarm gruel that you have to manually push past your lips with fingers that feel like thick sausages made of numbness. You would knock over your goblet. You would curse. You would starve within the day because the effort of eating would be too much. And that is without mentioning the pain of digestion when your internal organs are under assault. Every trip to the privy would be an exercise in humiliation and physical trauma that you simply do not have the psychological armor to withstand. But let us assume you somehow make it through the morning. The real day begins. Governance. Baldwin IV was a king in a kingdom that was a miracle and a curse. The kingdom of Jerusalem was surrounded by enemies, fractured by internal politics, and perpetually short of men. He inherited a throne at 13 while already showing symptoms. His father had died, and the regency fell to Raymond of Tripoli, but Baldwin had to assert himself long before he reached majority. You, at 13, were worried about acne or whether someone liked you. Baldwin was reading military dispatches about raids on caravans, about the movement of Saladin scouts, about the delicate balance of power with the Hospitallers and Templars who were basically independent military orders inside his realm. You would not understand one word of Old French, Latin, or Arabic. You would not know that when a vassal knelt, you had to watch his hands, not his eyes, because the hands hold the dagger. You would misread every signal, trust every honeyed word, and likely sign a charter giving away half your kingdom in exchange for a promise of relief from your own skin. The court was a pit of vipers. Sibylla, his sister, was the pawn and eventual queen of everyone's schemes. His mother, Agnes of Courtenay, was ambitious and hated. The barons were constantly trying to marry Sibylla off to some candidate who would then effectively usurp the throne, using the Leper King's declining health as an excuse. You would be told, gently, repeatedly, that you should step aside, that you should retire to some monastery, that you should let a whole man lead. And because you are you would listen. You would feel the sting of rejection and just give up. Baldwin did not give up. He knew that his very existence as a crowned-ointed king was the only thing preventing civil war before Saladin even had to lift a finger. He held on with nothing but willpower, because his body offered no support. You would slink away, crying, to your chambers, and the kingdom would crumble that very afternoon. That is not an exaggeration. One of you on the throne would lead to a coup by dusk. Now we come to the core of why you would not last. Physical pain. You have never, I promise you, experienced the kind of pain that leprosy inflicts over years. It is not a constant, static ache. It is a symphony of nerve damage and regeneration misfires. Sometimes the pain is a burning that feels like your limbs are held in fire. Sometimes it is a deep, bone-grinding ache as the structural integrity of your skeleton is compromised. Sometimes it is the phantom agony of a limb you still have but cannot feel properly, so your brain invents torment. Baldwin went into battle with this. He rode a horse, one-handed, because by 16 his right hand was so crippled he had to learn to fight with his left. He commanded from the saddle, wearing armor over a body that was essentially a live wound. You cannot comprehend the sheer, relentless defiance of that. You, who call in sick to work because of a headache, would be unable to even mount a horse. The smell of the horse, the jostling of the saddle, the weight of chainmail on ulcerated shoulders, you would faint. And if you fainted on the battlefield, you would be trampled or captured, and the day would end in disaster. The Battle of Montgassard. 1177, Baldwin was 16 years old. He had been king for 3 years, his leprosy already advanced. Saladin, the greatest general of the age, invaded with a massive army. Baldwin mustered what few hundred knights and few thousand infantry he could, and he marched them to Ascalon, then broke out and raced to intercept Saladin before Jerusalem was threatened. He rode at the head of his forces, carrying the true cross, while his body was literally falling apart. The night before the battle, do you know what he did? He knelt and prayed, not for healing, he was long past that illusion, but for victory. The weight of his armor on his knees must have been excruciating. You would have been weeping and bargaining with God, making promises you could not keep. The next morning he led a charge that shattered Saladin's army. He fought, with one working hand, despite blurred vision, despite the constant distraction of his own flesh screaming. The battle was a miracle, one of the most stunning upset victories of the Crusades. And Baldwin survived it. You would have been dead in the first charge, not from a Saracen blade, but from your own body giving out. Your hide would have exploded from the strain, or you would have dropped your sword because your fingers could no longer close around the hilt. One day, one battle, and you are gone. And what about the aftermath? Victory did not bring peace. Baldwin had to deal with the prisoners, the distribution of spoils, the care of the wounded, and the immediate political fallout because every success made his nobles more eager to see his sister married to a strong warrior who could follow up. He had to navigate all this while his wounds from the saddle were cleaned by physicians using honey and wine, while he dictated letters with a voice that was growing hoarser as the disease touched his larynx. You would be a delirious mess, demanding more milk of the poppy than was safe, and you would overdose yourself into oblivion. Baldwin used opium sparingly because he needed his mind clear. Your mind, fogged by agony and self-pity, would make a catastrophic decision. Perhaps you would send an insulting message to Saladin. Perhaps you would strip a vassal of his lands in a fit of paranoia. Perhaps you would simply collapse in public and be seen as a broken, useless thing, losing all authority in a single embarrassing moment. Authority, for a Leper King, was like holding water in cupped, nerveless hands. It leaked out with every tremor. Baldwin kept his through sheer force of presence, through a voice that still carried command, through eyes behind the mask that judged and knew. You have no such presence. Your presence is entirely dependent on the body you inhabit, and that body would be a ruin that you let define you. Now, let us speak of the humiliation. The daily, grinding, soul-crushing humiliation. Being a leper in the medieval world was to be considered already dead. The Fourth Lateran Council would later decree that lepers must be separated from the healthy, must wear distinctive clothing, must carry a clapper or bell to warn others. Baldwin was technically exempt from all that because he was king, but the stigma clung to him like a second, invisible cloak. When he entered a room, the conversation stopped for a beat too long. People held their breath. They angled their bodies away. They avoided meeting his eyes because they were afraid of seeing what was behind the mask. A king who cannot be looked at directly is a king who is constantly being deposed in the hearts of his subjects. You, who crave validation, who need to be liked, would shatter under the weight of that unspoken revulsion. You would become a recluse. Baldwin could not afford to be a recluse. He had to hold court, receive ambassadors, be seen. Every public appearance was an act of war against his own instinct to hide. You would hide. And a king who hides is a king no longer. There was a particular cruelty in the way his disease progressed in such a visible, undeniable way. The extremities went first. Fingers curled into the claw hand. Toes shortened as the bones resorbed. Walking became a careful negotiation with balance. He had to learn to walk with a dignity that compensated for the shuffle, for the slight limp, for the foot that didn't feel the floor properly. He fell more than once in private. In public, he never allowed a stumble to become a fall because the symbolism of a falling king would be fatal. You, with your modern body used to even pavement, would tumble down the stone steps of the citadel within hours and break something that would then never heal properly. A broken bone for a leper was a lifelong sentence to worse disability. You would be bedridden, and your day would end with you staring at the ceiling, waiting for death. Let us not forget the climate. The kingdom of Jerusalem is hot, dusty, and brutal. Leprosy damages the sweat glands, so thermoregulation is impaired. Baldwin was likely prone to overheating, to heat stroke, while wearing heavy royal robes. The sun on the metal mask could turn it into a small oven. He had to campaign in this, ride for days in this, without the luxury of air conditioning, without even the ability to wipe his brow properly because his brow might not have been able to tolerate a cloth. You would be a puddle of sweat and misery, complaining incessantly, and your knights would lose all respect for you within the first hour of the march. Dehydration would set in because you would be too proud or too incompetent to drink from a waterskin while riding. By midday, you would be seeing mirages and giving nonsensical orders. The army would turn back, and you would be remembered as the fool who melted on his first day. And what about the loneliness? Baldwin was, by the nature of his illness, untouchable. He could never marry, never have an heir of his body, never know the comfort of a lover's embrace. Leprosy was seen as both contagious and a divine punishment, so physical intimacy was forbidden by both church and custom. His sister was a political tool. His mother was often away. His friends? How many friends can a king have when half his court is waiting for him to die? He must have been crushingly, abysmally alone. You are a creature who requires connection. You need texts, calls, validation. Imagine a whole day without anyone touching your hand except when they had to, with medical detachment. You would start talking to yourself, hallucinate, or curl up in a fetal position. Baldwin transformed that isolation into a kind of remote, awe-inspiring mystique. He became this suffering servant, in the minds of his people, almost a living saint. But that transformation cost him every night of sleep. You would not sleep at all, not in a strange castle with the sounds of a city you don't understand, with the knowledge that Saladin's spies might be inside the walls, with the pain gnawing at you like rats. Insomnia would claim your sanity by dawn, and you would be found babbling about home, about your old life, completely incapable of command. Baldwin spoke Latin, Old French, and likely had some Arabic and Greek. He had been educated by William of Tyre, the great chronicler and archbishop. He could debate theology, assess a legal dispute, write a diplomatic letter in his own hand when his hand still worked. You would be illiterate in every relevant tongue. An interpreter could help, but an interpreter can lie, can misinterpret, can subtly alter the tone. A king who relies entirely on translators is a king who rules through a filter he cannot see through. You would sign a document you thought was a trade agreement and discover it was a surrender of Acre. You would try to compliment an emir and accidentally insult his mother. Within one day, you would trigger a war, an excommunication, or both. The administrative machine of the kingdom would grind to a halt because you couldn't understand the basic petitions put before you. The clerks would roll their eyes, the barons would exchange glances, and by sunset a regency council would have declared you unfit, locking you in a comfortable tower for your own protection. But let's get really physical again. The feet. We haven't talked enough about the feet. A king must stand 4 hours during ceremonies. For battle in stirrups. Baldwin's feet were likely mutilated. Neuropathic ulcers, infections, bones dissolving. Shoes had to be specially made, padded, but the padding would rub against insensate areas and create new wounds. The simple act of putting on footwear was a negotiation with agony. Walking was a constant risk of stepping on something sharp and not noticing until the wound was deep and full of dirt. To be a medieval king was to be on your feet more than you might think. Processions, greeting pilgrims, standing in the chapel for Massachusetts. You would be looking for a chair within 10 minutes. You would be seen as weak. You would be seen as lazy. You would not be able to stand on the walls of Jerusalem to rally the defenders during an alarm. If a sudden raid occurred, you would be scrambling, literally off balance, and your personal guard would have to carry you while you screamed. A day that included a military crisis, and such crises were frequent, would end with you as a hostage or a corpse. Let's introduce such a crisis now. Imagine it is the day you arrive. magically inserted into Baldwin's body and life. Saladin, ever watchful, hears from his intelligence network that the Leper King is acting strangely. That's you. He sends a probing force to test the defenses. A rider gallops in. My lord, Saracen raiders have crossed the Jordan. They burn the villages nearby. San. What do? You are in the middle of a meal, your body aching, your mind fuzzy. You have no military experience. The constable, the marshal, they look to you for orders. Do you rally the knights? Do you send a detachment? Do you sue for peace? Every second of hesitation burns villages and kills peasants, your subjects, whose lives you are sworn to protect. Baldwin would have been on his horse with a plan before the messenger finished speaking, because he had spent years internalizing the geography, the troop dispositions, the personality of every enemy commander. You would ask for a map that you cannot read in a language you do not know, and then ask the wrong person for advice. That person might be a traitor. Or you might, in panic, order a general charge without scouts, leading your best knights into an ambush. The Horns of Hattin happened after Baldwin's death, but you could create a miniature Hattin on your very first day. By sunset, the field army of Jerusalem would be slaughtered, and Saladin would be sending you a congratulations note for your stupidity. You would be remembered as the worst king in a single day of rule. Even without a battle, the political maneuvering would destroy you. Agnes of Courtenay would try to control you. Raymond of Tripoli would try to outmaneuver her. Reynold of Chatillon, that reckless hawk, would be demanding permission to raid caravans and break treaties. You, being new, would not know that granting Reynold's request could bring the full might of Islam down on the kingdom. Or you would listen to Raymond, the voice of caution, and be accused of cowardice. Every advisor would see you as a puppet because the real Baldwin was iron-willed. You are soft wax. By mid-afternoon, your own council would be shouting at each other while you sat there, invisible behind the mask, contributing nothing. They would quickly move to isolate you, and you would consent to everything because you'd be too exhausted to resist. You would appoint someone else to handle the tedious matters, effectively abdicating in fact while still wearing the crown. And that person would likely be assassinated before midnight, leaving you completely alone in a hostile palace with no idea who to trust. And what of the spiritual weight? Baldwin was a devout Christian, a crusader king who believed that his suffering had a purpose, that he was imitating Christ's passion in some small way. He heard Mass daily when possible, confessed, prayed. The true cross was his talisman. The burden of being the defender of the holy places was immense. He carried the weight of Christendom's expectations. You, in all likelihood, do not share that particular medieval mindset. You would be a skeptic or a modern believer, lost in the theological maze of relics and penances. The priests would see your lack of faith as a bad omen. The soldiers who went into battle under the sign of the cross would feel that something was spiritually wrong with their king. Morale would collapse. In the 12th century, a king was a religious figure. You would be a secular void, unable to bless, unable to inspire with holy fervor. Your first public mass would be a disaster. You'd fumble the responses, you'd stare blankly at the elevated host, and rumors would start that the Leper King was now an apostate or possessed. You would be excommunicated within a week, but within a day, the Templars might already be plotting to depose you as unworthy. Now night falls. The sun sets over Jerusalem, that golden city you have never seen except in dreams. Your first day as Baldwin is ending. You are still alive, technically. But look at what has happened. You have alienated your court, lost a battle or several villages, humiliated yourself before the servants, and endured a level of physical agony that has you trembling and weeping silently behind the mask. You are hungry, thirsty, your clothes are soaked with fluids you do not want to name. You have not managed to write a single coherent order, not established a single meaningful relationship. The maids who come to help you undress recoil. The physician who examines your wounds wears a perfume-saturated cloth over his nose. You are alone in a stone room, with the distant sounds of a city that you are supposed to protect but cannot. And in that moment, the full existential horror sets in. This is not a nightmare you can wake from. This is your life now, and it will get worse. Tomorrow the real sores will hurt more. Tomorrow Saladin will come in person. Tomorrow you will have to sit in judgment and could sentence a man to death by your word. You would, in that moment of despair, do something foolish. Perhaps you would send a secret message to Saladin offering surrender, only to have it intercepted. Perhaps you would try to flee the city, and be caught by your own guards. Perhaps you would simply take a knife and end your own suffering, the one final act of control left to you. And that is why you would not last a day as King Baldwin IV. Not because you are a coward, but because you are human in the modern sense, and Baldwin was something else entirely. He was a human being who transcended the definition of human limits. He ruled for over a decade with leprosy, won a major battle, maintained the kingdom, and died at 24 after ensuring a flawed succession. He got out of bed every day for more than 3,000 days facing what I just described. You, with all your contemporary knowledge, would not manage one. Because in the end, Baldwin's strength was not in his arms or his face or his health. It was in his ability to constantly, minute by minute, say yes to a life that had become a protracted torture chamber for the sake of a crown and a kingdom he believed God had given him. Your strength is conditional. You need comfort, you need hope, you need a timeline for your suffering. Baldwin had none of those. He had only duty and the iron mask of his own soul. You would last a day? You would not last the hour before you begged whatever God you believe in to take you home. And that, my friend, is not a shame. It is simply the truth. The Leper King was a miracle of will, and miracles, by definition, are not repeatable by ordinary people. You are ordinary. I am ordinary. We would all break. That's why his story endures, because it reminds us what a single human being can bear when there is no alternative but to bear it. And we, soft and safe, can only listen and shudder. Now go on. Imagine your first day again. This time, feel the phantom pains in your own fingers. Smell the air. See the mask before your eyes. And know in your bones that you would fail. That is the gift of Baldwin's memory, to make us appreciate the simple, pain-free day we have today. Don't waste it. He didn't. Not one single day. Sit back down. You thought the first day ended? That was only the threshold. I told you why you couldn't survive a single sunrise to sunset as Baldwin IV. But let me be crueler. Let me drag you into the next hour, and the hour after that, because you don't even understand the half of it. You think the humiliation, the pain, the politics were the worst? You haven't heard about the dressing changes. You haven't heard about the sister. You haven't heard about the boy king you had to create because your own body was a time bomb. You haven't heard about the moment you have to look at a man you despise and give him your sister because the kingdom demands it. So now we go deeper. Into the flesh. Into the family. Into the endless, grinding machinery of a day that never, ever lets up. Let's go back to that morning. You've managed to sit up. You've managed not to scream while the tunic is pulled over your head. Now the physicians enter. In the 12th century, a leper king's medical care was both primitive and horrifyingly intimate. They would unwrap your bandages from the night. The bandages that have been pressed against open ulcers for hours. When they peel them off, the dried fluids and dead skin come with them. You will feel it, not as sharp pain because the nerves are dead in places, but as a deep, sickening tug that travels up into your gut. You will smell the rot more intensely, a smell like spoiled meat and old cheese and something uniquely, personally yours. The physicians will inspect the wounds. They will poke at the edges with instruments to see if there's sensation. There isn't, but your brain still expects it, and the disconnect makes you nauseous. They will cut away dead flesh. Without effective anesthesia. Maybe a leather strap to bite on. You, who dread a dental cleaning, would be howling and thrashing. Baldwin lay still. He had learned to separate his mind from his meat. You would fail, and the physicians would have to call guards to hold you down, and the whole castle would hear the Leper King screaming like a child. Your authority would evaporate in that room, with the bandages on the floor. And then the ointments. Concoctions of herbs, honey, wine, sometimes myrrh, smeared directly into the raw wounds. Some of them sting. Some of them cause a cold burn that lasts for hours. Then fresh linen, tightly bound to keep the limbs from swelling and to hold the shape of what was left of his hands and feet. The binding of a leper's hands was an art. Too loose, and the fingers would curl into useless claws faster. Too tight, and the circulation would cut off entirely, causing new ulcers. The binders had to be skilled and careful. But even skilled hands cause pain when they manipulate joints that are already dissolving. You would be crying and begging them to stop. Baldwin would be discussing the day's appointments while this happened, his voice controlled, occasionally pausing to take a sip of water or to give an instruction. You cannot chew gum and walk at the same time. Baldwin could have his rotting flesh trimmed while planning a military campaign. One day, you wouldn't even get through the medical hour. Now let's talk about his sister Sibylla. She's not just a sibling. She's the future of the dynasty. Baldwin loved her in his way, but he also had to use her as the prime bargaining chip in a kingdom that was surrounded by wolves. She was beautiful, high-spirited, and utterly aware that her brother's disease meant she would be the conduit for the next king. Can you imagine looking at your own sister and knowing that you must marry her to a man who will effectively replace you, and that you must choose that man not for her happiness but for the survival of the realm? That is a weight that crushes souls. You, in Baldwin's place, would make a sentimental choice. You'd let her marry the handsome, charming newcomer who flatters you. Baldwin made that mistake, or nearly so, with Guy de Lusignan. But Baldwin learned. He saw Guy's incompetence, his arrogance, and he tried to undo the match. He had to fight his own family, his own mother, his own sister, to prevent Guy from seizing power too soon. You would hand the kingdom to the first smooth-talking knight who promised to take the burden off your shoulders. You would hug him and call him brother and sign the regency over before lunch. And by mid-afternoon, Guy would have you locked in a tower and be running the kingdom into the ground. Your day would end not with a whimper but with a betrayal you enabled. But Baldwin didn't just fight Guy. He had to deal with the Templars and the Hospitallers. The military orders were nominally under the king's authority, but in practice they answered to the Pope and their own Grand Masters. They were the best fighters in the kingdom and also the most uncontrollable. The Templars, especially, pursued aggressive policies against Saladin, often against royal strategy. You would try to give them an order, and the Grand Master would look at you with barely concealed contempt, a Leper King in a mask telling battle-hardened warrior monks what to do. They might obey, or they might just happen to interpret your orders loosely. You lack the force of personality to bring them to heel. Baldwin used a combination of theological authority, personal courage, he was one of them in spirit, fighting despite his body, and sheer regal presence. You have none of that. You'd be a puppet, and the Templars would be pulling strings before the sun was high. And then there's Reynold of Chatillon. That man was a firebrand, a former prince of Antioch who had been tortured by Muslims for years and came out the other side absolutely feral. He raided caravans during truces, he dreamed of conquering Mecca, he was a liability in almost every diplomatic sense. But he was also a fearless fighter, and the kingdom needed his castle at Carrick, needed his swords. Baldwin had to manage him, rein him in, use him, but not let him start a war that would bring the full force of Islam down on them. You, in one day, would either let Reynold run wild and thus break a truce with Saladin, triggering an invasion, or you would try to clamp down so hard that Reynold would defy you openly, revealing your impotence. Baldwin walked that line for years. He personally dragged himself, dying, to Carrick to rescue a besieged wedding party when Saladin attacked. You would not be able to ride a horse by that point in the disease. You would send someone else, and that someone else would lose, and the kingdom would fracture. Now, the succession. This is where it becomes unbearable. Baldwin knew, with absolute certainty, that he was dying. Every day he was a little less alive. His body was a calendar of decay. He had to arrange for an heir who was not yet born from his own body, because he could never marry. The solution was his nephew, Baldwin IV, Sibylla's son from her first marriage. A child. Baldwin IV crowned that child as co-king in 1183, making him Baldwin V. Imagine the ceremony. The Leper King, barely able to stand, his hands useless claws covered in silk gloves, placing a crown on the head of a little boy. He was handing over the weight that had crushed his own life to a child, hoping the boy would grow to be a man before Saladin tore the kingdom apart. You would weep. You would break down in the cathedral, causing a scene, because the tragedy of it would overwhelm you. Baldwin held it together. He had to. He was the king, and kings do not weep in public when the future of the Holy Land is on a child's brow. You would show weakness at that pivotal moment, and the factions would start circling before the incense smoke cleared. He also had to strip Guy de Lusignan of the regency. This happened when Baldwin was very ill, but let's imagine that day. He had given Guy power during one of his illnesses, and Guy proved disastrous. Baldwin had to take it back, a public humiliation of his sister's husband. He had to summon the barons, have the legal documents drawn up, and formally revoke Guy's authority. The tension in the room would be suffocating. Sibylla would be furious, hurt. Guy would be murderous. The barons would be watching to see if the Leper King still had the will to assert dominance over a healthy, armed knight. Baldwin did it. He looked at Guy with his mask and his failing voice and made it stick. You would try, and your voice would tremble. Guy would laugh. And that laughter would be the end of your reign. You cannot command the room when your own body is a testimony against you. Baldwin commanded it because his soul was forged in a fire you cannot even imagine. Let's talk about the progression of symptoms deeper into the day. By late morning, if you were Baldwin, you would experience a phenomenon called burning feet or spontaneous neuropathic pain, a searing, electric agony that shoots through limbs that are otherwise numb. It comes unpredictably. You might be in the middle of hearing a petition about water rights when suddenly your leg feels like it's held in a brazier. You cannot scream. You cannot even flinch visibly, because the petitioners must see the king as unmoved, as above bodily frailties. You would scream. You would clutch your leg and fall off the throne. The petition would go unheard, justice delayed, the realm's business interrupted, and your mask might slip, revealing the grotesque reality beneath. The rumor would spread. The king is losing his mind with pain. The hands. The hands. By this stage of Baldwin's life, his hands were likely retracted into claws, the muscles wasted, the fingers drawn into a permanent semi-fist. He couldn't hold a quill. He dictated. But a king must sign documents. So a wax seal was pressed, or a stamp used, or a pre-drawn signature applied. But in some crucial moment, a treaty with a foreign power, you might need to make a mark. You would fumble the stamp. It would fall into the hot wax, splattering it. The ambassador would note this. An omen, he would think. The Leper King's hands cannot even manage a seal. By the time the letter reached Saladin, the story would be of a dying cripple who can't hold his own seal. You would have diminished the kingdom's perceived strength by a measurable degree with that single, clumsy act. Baldwin's courtiers learned to seamlessly cover such moments, to anticipate and assist without being asked, because they were a well-oiled machine built around his needs. You would have no such team, because you'd have alienated everyone by mid-morning. And the eyes. Leprosy can affect the eyes. Logophthalmus inability to close them fully, corneal insensitivity, leading to ulcers, blindness. Baldwin's sight was threatened. He had to use eye drops, likely rose water or herbal infusions, to keep his eyes from drying out and scarring. Imagine sitting in a dusty council chamber, with the windows open for light, and the fine desert grit settling on your eyeballs because you cannot blink fully. You would be rubbing them constantly, risking infection. By evening, your vision would be blurred, and you would be squinting at maps, mistaking troop positions. A wrong order sent because you couldn't see clearly would lead to an ambush. You would be the blind king who led his men into a trap. Baldwin dealt with failing eyesight by relying on trusted scouts and detailed verbal reports, mentally mapping everything. You don't have that mental discipline. Now let's talk about love. Or the complete absence of it. Baldwin could never be loved as a man. He could be respected, admired, pitied, even revered as a holy martyr. But not loved. Not held. Not desired. His sister's daughters would never sit on his lap without a barrier of cloth. He could never play with his nephew properly. Human touch was medical or ceremonial. You are a being starving for affection. You would reach out, unconsciously, to touch someone's hand or shoulder, and they would recoil in terror. That recoil would happen in front of the court. You would see the revulsion, and your heart would shatter. You would retreat into yourself, becoming bitter, sullen, or weepy. A king cannot afford that. Baldwin sublimated his need for love into a fierce, protective love for his kingdom and his God. You cannot sublimate anything in a day. You'd be emotionally crippled before noon. And the food situation gets worse. Let's assume you try to eat lunch. The royal table is set with the finest foods, roasted lamb, spiced wine, fruits. You cannot taste them fully, because leprosy can dull the sense of taste, or make things taste metallic, or just wrong. The effort of chewing when your jaw joints are affected is exhausting. You might drool because the muscles around the mouth are weakened. You would be sitting at the high table, in front of the entire household, trying to eat without drooling, without choking, without your claw hands sending a goblet crashing. You would fail. Red wine would spill down your white tunic like a wound. The household would look away, embarrassed. You would feel the heat of shame, and you would lose your appetite entirely. Malnutrition would accelerate. Baldwin forced himself to eat, slowly, deliberately, because he knew he needed strength. You would starve yourself out of embarrassment. Now, a specific scenario. The day Baldwin had to deal with the embassy from Saladin. At some point, Saladin sent envoys to negotiate truces. Baldwin received them seated, probably masked and gloved, his robes arranged to hide as much as possible. The envoys, sophisticated Muslims from a culture that valued cleanliness and wholeness, would have known exactly what they were dealing with. They would have been polite, but there would be an undercurrent. You would feel it, the unspoken horror, the pity, the faint condescension. You would get defensive, aggressive, or you would try too hard to be liked. Baldwin was icily calm. He negotiated from a position of equality despite his body being a ruin, because his mind and his kingdom's sword were still sharp. You would, in your insecurity, give away a concession just to end the meeting early, just to escape their gaze. A year's truce? Granted. A caravan route? Take it. And you would have sold the security of the realm for a moment's relief from social discomfort. And then there's the isolation within your own family. Agnes of Courtenay, his mother, was a political operator. She loved her son, but she also loved power. She and her brother Jocelyn were constantly maneuvering. Could you trust your own mother? Baldwin had to love her and simultaneously block her schemes when they endangered the kingdom. You would be completely under her thumb, a mama's boy in the worst way, or you would lash out and create a family civil war within the palace. Either way, the day would be consumed by domestic squabbles while Saladin sharpened his scimitar. Night again. But this night is worse than the first. The accumulated weariness of a day spent entirely in a body that is actively attacking itself. Your joints are swollen with secondary infections. You might have a low-grade fever because your immune system is haywire, or because an ulcer is becoming septic. You are shivering and sweating at the same time. The bed feels like a bed of nails. You try to pray, but your mind is a fog of pain and despair. Baldwin prayed. The divine office, the psalms that spoke of suffering and deliverance. He found meaning in the darkness. You would find only a void. You would curse God for putting you in this body, this time, this role. And that spiritual collapse would be the final nail. A king who has lost faith in his holy mission in Jerusalem is a king who is nothing. The holy city would feel it. The priests would sense it. By the next morning, you would be a hollow shell, and the real powers would move you aside. But we are still on day one. You see? The first day never ends in your imagination. It just keeps spiraling deeper into fresh hells you never considered. So here's the truth, the uncompromising, brutal truth. Baldwin IV lasted not one day but thousands, each one a miniature Golgotha. He died at 24, blind, crippled, covered in sores, but still king, still undefeated in spirit. You would not last one day because you lacked the central fire that animated him. A complete, self-annihilating dedication to a cause beyond his own existence. You care about your comfort, your image, your relationships. Baldwin sacrificed all those on the altar of duty. He lived as if he were already dead, and therefore every word, every decision, had the weight of a final testament. You live as if you deserve more time. That's the difference. That's why, if I threw you into Jerusalem in 1183, by Vespers you would be a weeping, deposed, forgotten wreck. And Baldwin would still be on his throne, a silver mask glinting in the candlelight, waiting for Saladin, waiting for death, waiting for the next impossible day. Don't you dare think you could do it. Not for one single day. Not you. Not anyone ordinary. And you are profoundly, blessedly ordinary. Hold on to that. But not your enthas. You've sat through the waking nightmare, the medical horror, the political abattoir, the familial betrayals. You felt, in some small, distant way, the phantom of his suffering. But we haven't talked about the one day you definitely wouldn't survive. The last one. The day Baldwin IV of Jerusalem finally let go. And more importantly, what happened after. Because your failure as the Leper King wouldn't just be a personal collapse. It would be a historical cataclysm. Your single day of weakness would light a fuse that burns down the entire kingdom of Jerusalem. And when the smoke clears, you would be remembered not as a tragic figure, but as the fool who dropped the holy city into Saladin's lap. So let's walk into the deepest chamber of this hell. Baldwin's body, by the age of 23, is a closed room that barely functions. He is blind now, or nearly so. The eyes have ulcerated past repair. The lids cannot close, so even in darkness he sees light as a torment. His hands are useless. His feet are formless, unable to bear weight. He cannot walk. He is carried in a litter, a living corpse with a crown on a cushion beside him, because his head can no longer support the weight of the gold without agony. His voice is a whisper, rasping through a throat constricted by nodules and chronic inflammation. He has lost the ability to eat normally. He subsists on broths and watered wine that still taste like ash. Every breath is a conscious decision, a push against fluid in lungs that are slowly filling because his body can no longer clear its own passages. And yet, He is still king. He still receives reports. He still gives orders. He still dictates letters. The brain, that final fortress, holds until the walls crumble. You would not last 1 minute in that state. The moment you lost your sight, you would panic. The moment you lost your legs, you would despair. The moment you lost your voice, you would be utterly useless, a silent, blind, immobile thing with no way to project authority. But Baldwin projected authority from a litter. He made his weakness a kind of pulpit. When he was carried into the council chamber, the barons fell silent not out of pity, but out of awe. A man who should have been dead years ago was still ruling, still calculating, still fighting. The sheer force of his continued existence was a political weapon. Saladin himself, a man not given to sentiment, respected the Leper King. He once said, or so chroniclers claim, that while Baldwin lived, Jerusalem was a lock without a key. The day you inhabit that body, the lock shatters on the floor. And now we come to the deathbed. Baldwin IV died in the spring of 1185, likely in March. He was 24. He had reigned for 11 years, which is an eternity for a leprous teenager in the 12th century. His final days were spent in the palace, surrounded by the few who could tolerate the smell, the sight, the sound of his breathing. His mother was there. His sister, perhaps, torn between grief and the terrible calculus of power. The little boy King Baldwin IV, his nephew, was crowned and anointed, a child of 6 carrying the weight his uncle could no longer hold. Imagine the scene. The dying king, too weak to speak, signaling by some minute gesture that he wished the crown to pass, that the truce with Saladin must hold, that the regency must be arranged. Every second of consciousness was spent on the kingdom's future. He did not bemoan his fate. He did not curse God. The chronicler William of Tyre, who had tutored him, recorded nothing of the sort. He simply finished. The engine of his will ran until there was no fuel left. You, in that deathbed, would have been a different creature. You would have raged. You would have wept. You would have begged for more milk of the poppy, more wine, more anything to dull the existential terror of blinking out into the dark at 24. You would have clutched at your mother and sobbed about the unfairness. You would have, in a final act of selfishness, undone every careful arrangement Baldwin had made. Perhaps you would have, in a delirious moment, declared Guy de Lusignan regent after all, because he was your sister's husband and you just wanted peace in the family. Perhaps you would have revoked the truce, crying out for one last glorious crusade to save your soul. Perhaps you would have simply died screaming, a spectacle that would demoralize every knight in the kingdom. Either way, your death would be an unraveling, not a sealing. Baldwin's death was a sealing. He died as he lived, holding the kingdom together with the sheer adhesive force of his suffering. You would die as you lived, a messy, pathetic, ordinary human who broke under pressure. And that would make all the difference. Because what happened after Baldwin died? Guy de Lusignan outmaneuvered everyone. Little boy King Baldwin IV died within a year. Sibylla crowned Guy. And in July 1187, at the Horns of Hattin, Guy led the army of Jerusalem into a disaster that makes every prior crusade tragedy look like a skirmish. The true cross was captured. The flower of the kingdom's chivalry was slaughtered or taken prisoner. Reynold of Chatillon was executed by Saladin personally. And on October 2, 1187, Saladin took Jerusalem. The city that Baldwin had protected with his rotting hands fell because the man who replaced him lacked everything Baldwin had: patience, strategic sense, the ability to hold a fragile coalition together, and a deep, bone-deep understanding of the enemy. Guy charged into a waterless desert in midsummer because he was impetuous and desperate to prove himself. Baldwin would never have done that. Baldwin knew exactly when to fight and when to outlast. He had won Montgassard not by superior numbers but by superior judgment and an iron nerve. You, in Guy's place, would have done even worse. You would have lost Jerusalem before the summer of 1185 was over. Your day as Baldwin would have accelerated the timeline of catastrophe. You would be the short-lived footnote who handed over the keys to the Holy Sepulchre because you couldn't handle a saddle sore. And now, let's bring it full circle. The reason you wouldn't last a single day as King Baldwin IV is not just because of the pain, the leprosy, the politics, or the loneliness. It is because you lack the singular quality that made him an immovable object in history, the absolute, unshakable conviction that his suffering mattered. That every ulcer, every deformed knuckle, every night of choking sleep was a brick in the wall that held back the flood. He believed he was placed on that throne by God, not in spite of his disease, but because of it. His leprosy was his crown of thorns. He was the suffering servant of Jerusalem, a living icon of the kingdom's own perilous state, and he wielded that symbolism with a sophistication that no healthy king could match. He turned his curse into a covenant. You cannot do that. You see your suffering as meaningless, as something to be escaped. You are a modern creature who believes in pain management and mental health days and the fundamental unfairness of unearned agony. All of that is sane and human. But Baldwin was not sane in that way. He was a 12th century zealot who had been forged in a fire of theology and chivalry and a child's oath taken before he understood what he was swearing. He could not break because he did not believe breaking was an option that applied to him. You would break because you know deep down that no crown, no city, no abstract duty is worth a single hour of that torment. And you would be right. But rightness doesn't keep a kingdom alive. Only suffering willingly embraced can do that. And you, my friend, are not built to embrace the whip. So here you sit, back in your safe life, with your whole, pain-free body, your comfortable chair, your future that stretches out like a gentle, unthreatening road. You have listened to the anatomy of a day you could never survive, and now you know the end. Baldwin died. Jerusalem fell. The Crusader kingdom staggered on for another century from the coastal cities, but the jewel was gone. All that suffering, you might think, was for nothing. But that is where you would be wrong again. It was not for nothing. It was for those 11 years. It was for Montgassard. It was for the truces that bought time for thousands to live, for babies to be born, for prayers to be said at the Holy Sepulchre. It was for the sheer, incomprehensible statement it made to the world, that a leper boy could stand against Saladin and win, that the weakest vessel could hold the strongest fire. That is the legacy. You, with your one day, would have extinguished that fire before it ever caught. You would have left no legacy, just a vacancy, a kingdom sold for a moment's comfort. Baldwin IV's life was a miracle of duration. His every day was a defiance of biology, of physics, of human psychology. You cannot last a day in his body because you are not a miracle. You are a person, and people have limits. Baldwin seemed to have none, because he had erased the very concept of a limit from his mind. He had become a pure instrument of will. You have never been an instrument of anything except your own wants and needs. And that is not an insult. It is the definition of being alive in the normal, healthy way. But it disqualifies you utterly from that throne, that mask, that endless, grinding Calvary. Now I'm done. The final part is over. You will walk away from this, and your own day will seem impossibly light, impossibly gentle. You will feel the absence of pain as a positive gift. You will understand, perhaps for the first time, that the greatest luxury in human history is a body that does not scream at you. Baldwin never had that luxury after the age of 9. He lived a whole lifetime in the scream. And he did it for a kingdom that still fell after he was gone. You, in the same scream, would not last a single sunrise. Not one. And that is perfectly, agonizingly human. Go now. Live your ordinary day. And if you ever feel the slightest twinge of self-pity, remember the silver mask. Remember the boy who wore it. And know that you are the luckiest creature on earth to never have to be him.